Good evening. Once again, welcome to my channel. Today, I want to talk about Venezuela, what's been going on in the news with Venezuela. Now, if you've been following the news, all of a sudden, there's a political upheaval in Venezuela. The opposition leader has suddenly declared himself president out of nowhere, and there's potential for civil war and all manner of unrest. To a casual observer, listening to the news, CNN, Fox News, and who else may be out there talking about the situation, one would be led to assume that there's been corruption and all manner of malfeasance in Venezuela, and the people are upset and they're rising up in arms and demanding a change and so forth. But take a step back. Now, I'm not here to defend Maduro. He may be the most corrupt person on the planet. I'm not here to defend the opposition. I'm here to look at facts, realities. Because all of a sudden, out of nowhere, this situation pops up. Maduro has been in office since Chavez died. So, what happened between then and now that the opposition decides they're going to declare themselves president? Let's take a step back to understand what is going on in Venezuela, to understand what happened in Libya, to understand what happened in Iraq. We have to go way, way, way back to 1945 at the conclusion of the Second World War. Something happened. The victors and the losers, Germany, Britain, Japan, France, Italy, they all sat together and they decided one of the reasons that World War I and World War II broke out were economic reasons. I won't go into detail of how the sanctions imposed against Germany and the reparations Germany had to pay to the other European nations after World War I put Germany in dire economic straits. That eventually led to World War II. They knew that, and they did not want a repeat. So they came up with what was called the Bretton Woods Agreement. Google it, research it. What the Bretton Woods Agreement did is establish the US dollar as a global reserve currency, to which all other currencies would be pegged. In turn, the US made a commitment to these other nations that it would maintain currency stability. And the way it was going to do that, it was going to peg the US dollar to gold. I'm not sure the exact quantity, but let's make an assumption to say that it was decided that each dollar issued would be backed by a corresponding deposit of 1 ounce of gold in the US Federal Reserve System. So if the Fed was to issue $10,000, then there would be an equivalent 10,000 ounces of gold deposited in the Fed. Now, if I was Britain and I was to peg the pound to the dollar, and I was to peg it at half a pound equal to $1, that means if I was Britain and I issued 1,000 pounds, I would have to have in holding the equivalent of $500, because 1 pound equals half a pound equals $1. So I'd actually have to have, yes, $500 to issue 1,000 pounds. The understanding was that at any time I could walk up to the Fed and request, if I didn't want dollars, I could walk up to the Fed and request the equivalents in gold, and the Fed should be able to satisfy that request right away. So there was that implicit trust that these other nations placed in the US Fed, that all dollars issued would be secured by a corresponding equivalent of gold deposits. We had the Korean War, we had Vietnam. Wars cost money. Understand that. Wars cost money. Every time a nation goes to war, that nation has to borrow money. You have to buy fuel for the planes. You have to buy fuel for the tanks. You have to buy fuel for the warships. You have to buy fuel for the personnel, vehicles, transports. You have to buy bullets. You have to buy bombs. You have to buy missiles. You have to feed the troops. You have to house the troops. You have to transport the troops. That costs money. So war is not free. The Iraq War cost the U.S. a total of about $1.5 trillion, if not $2 trillion. That is why Bush Jr. inherited a budget surplus from Clinton, but within 1 to 2 years, we're back in deficits. Now, when these nations started to look at the U.S. waging all of these wars, they started to ask themselves, is that gold really there? So a lot of these nations started demanding gold redeemed instead of the dollars that they held. Now, at a certain point, that became a problem because the U.S. had been printing money that was not backed by gold. So Nixon had a choice. He was either going to tell these other nations, we don't have the gold to give you, or he was going to do what he did. And what he did in 1972, he took the dollar off of the gold standard. And from that point on, the dollar became a fiat currency. Fiat meaning that it is not backed by anything tangible. The Federal Reserve note, the dollar in your pocket, is backed by nothing more than the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. What does that mean, full faith? Full faith means that you have faith, you have belief in the U.S. government to be able to honor its obligations. Understand this. A dollar bill, let me pull one out. This right here. A dollar bill is nothing more than paper. It's nothing more than paper. I have a piece of paper here. I have this piece of paper. They're the same thing. The only thing that makes this piece of paper valuable and not this piece of paper is because this is an obligation. This is a debt on the U.S. government. The U.S. government owes me what this can buy. So let's say this could buy a Snickers bar. And the U.S. government, by me holding this, by me taking this from the U.S. government, means the U.S. government owes me a Snickers bar. That is what is meant by the full faith. What is meant by the credit is that I trust that the U.S. government is creditworthy, meaning that it can satisfy its debt obligations. That is what credit is about. So The problem in 72 was that how are we going to make these dollars worth anything when they're not backed by gold? Well, here comes Saudi Arabia. At that point, Saudi Arabia was the biggest producer of oil. Why do we talk about oil? Oil is the number one traded commodity in the world. Commodities, what are commodities? Gold, silver, coffee, cocoa, livestock. Those are commodities. Oil is the number one traded commodity in the world. Now, the deal that Nixon signed with the Saudis, with the House of Saud, was that we, the U.S., will guarantee the security of the House of Saud, not of Saudi Arabia, but of the House of Saud. Remember, the Saudi Arabian monarchy is a dictatorship. The problem bin Laden had with the U.S., well, he had two problems. His number one problem was that the U.S. backed the dictatorship of the House of Saud. His number two problem was that the U.S., in backing the dictatorship of the House of Saud, had stationed military troops on what he considered holy land, Mecca. Now, with this agreement, the Saudis agreed to sell all their oil in US dollars. If oil is the largest traded commodity in the world, and let's say 1,000 barrels of oil are sold a day, and each barrel is sold for $10, and I am a country, let's just say I'm Nicaragua, and I import oil, 100 barrels of oil, for $10. And let's say my currency in Nicaragua is the shinky shinky. All right? I cannot pay for that oil in shinky shinkies. I have to take my shinky shinkies and go get dollars to pay for that oil. So that always guarantees a demand for dollars. What does this guarantee do? If there's always going to be a demand for dollars, that means I can always sell US debt. How does that work? If I'm China, I'm the central bank of China, and I have companies in China that need to import oil. China Airlines, they need to import oil. I might have Chinese cargo ship lines, they need to import oil. All right? They can't pay for that oil in yuan, which is a Chinese currency. They have to exchange those yuans for dollars so they could pay for that oil. They're going to come to me, the central bank of China, and tell me, here, yuan, give me dollars. For me to be able to give them dollars, I buy US bonds. Because US bonds are debt obligations in the US government that are satisfied by biannual, semi-annual payments. These payments are made, these are interest payments, and they are made in dollars. So if I'm the Chinese central bank and I hold $10 billion worth of US bonds, and those US bonds are paying 10% interest a year, that means that every year I receive $1 billion in US currency. I could then take that $1 billion and exchange the yuan that companies, that individuals in China want to exchange for dollars. So by having all oil settled in dollars, that guaranteed a global demand for dollars and it guaranteed a global demand for US debt. And that went fine. There was no problem with that. Then all of a sudden, you get this man called Saddam Hussein in Iraq who decides, you know what? I don't want dollars for my oil anymore. I want euros. Now, go back. There was a time right around 2004, 2005, because I'm also a currency trader, and the euro kept tanking, tanking, tanking. There was an attack on the euro. Why was that? The objective was to destabilize the euro and reduce its attractiveness as a global reserve currency. Because if I'm Iraq and I want euros in payment, and I get 100 euros today for a barrel of oil, and all of a sudden the euro drops to $70 to a 70 euros to a dollar, that means that the euros that I have can buy less. So I might not want to hold euros. So there was that attack on euros. At the same time, when Saddam decided he wanted euros and not dollars, he had to go. You got to get out of here, Saddam. So they got rid of Saddam and brought in these little puppets they have who will now accept dollars for Iraqi oil. Iran. Well, before we talk about Iran, because they're still in power, Gaddafi. Gaddafi had two big problems with him. He had two very big problems with Gaddafi. Number one, Gaddafi decided he wanted gold for his oil. He didn't want dollars, he didn't want euros, he wanted gold. Big mistake, Gaddafi. Big mistake. Because Libya is a big producer. And sanctions had just been lifted in Libya, so all of that Libyan oil was going to come onto the market, increasing supply. And that supply was going to be paid for in gold? No, Gaddafi, you can't do that. The second problem Gaddafi made is he wanted to liberate Africa from the onus of dependence on the US. So Gaddafi was using his oil money to help build up Africa. And there's a problem with that. If Africans develop economically and they start processing their raw materials into finished products, then number one, they could compete with the West because those raw materials are local, so they're getting them at a cheaper cost. So they could produce a finished product at a cheaper price and sell it for a cheaper end price. So they could compete with the West. Number two, they now deny the West access to those cheap and abundant resources. So, two strikes against you, Gaddafi. You had to go. Now, Venezuela, when Chavez came on the scene, the number one mistake Chavez made, he nationalized all of the Venezuelan oil. What does that mean? That means that Chevron, BP, Exxon, they can't go in there and rape the Venezuelans anymore. Bad mistake, Chavez. Bad mistake. I think they killed him. Now Maduro comes along, and Maduro's talking to Iran, and he's talking to Russia, and they're talking to China, and they're saying, well, hold up. Why do we have to settle oil in dollars? We could settle oil in the renminbi. We could settle oil in SDRs, which are specialized drawing receipts from the IMF. We don't have to use dollars. So that's why Iran and Venezuela are on the hit list. Not because Iran sponsors terrorism. If you want to look at who sponsors terrorism, look at Saudi Arabia. All right? Look at Qatar. Look at Kuwait. Look at the UAE. Those are the state sponsors of terrorism. Not Iran, not Venezuela. Iran has never aggressed anyone. Iraq aggressed Iran, Iran responded. Iran has never aggressed anyone. Iran sponsors backs Hezbollah in Lebanon, who fight the Israelis when the Israelis try to encourage against Lebanon. They back Hamas, but Iran does not sponsor terrorism. Iran's problem is Iran does not want to sell its oil for dollars. Venezuela's problem is Venezuela does not want to sell its oil for dollars. That's what their problem is. And that's why the U.S. has made the decision that Maduro has to go. Plain and simple. Maduro has been here since Chavez. The opposition has been here since Chavez. So why all of a sudden does this problem just flare up? And then you got all these talking heads on television, Fox News, CNN. Some of them might just be dumb as shit and don't know what the hell they're talking about. Some of them might know what's going on, but they're not going to come there and say the truth, the ones that know what's going on. The idiots, a lot of them are just little pretty faces put on TV just because they're pretty faces, all right? The idiots don't know what's going on. The truth is, it all has to do with the dollar. Research it. There are efforts underway right now by China, Russia. I think India was part of it. I think Brazil was part of it. Iran, Venezuela, to stop selling oil in dollars. Now you might say, well, so what if they don't sell their oil in dollars? How's that going to impact us? Very simply. In the debt markets, the bond markets, you have a company called Moody's. And Moody's, I think it's Moody's and S&P. They rate the bonds. When they rate the bonds, when you talk about a bond rating, it's basically a question of how likely is this company, is this sovereign entity, is this state government, is this city government, is this county government, how likely are they to be able to repay the bond and to repay the interest on the bond? The top rating is AAA, and that's the rating that's given to U.S. Treasuries. That's U.S. Treasury bonds, U.S. Treasury notes. You have the 30-year bond, the 10-year bond, and the 5-year bond. Those are long-term maturities. In the Treasury notes, you have the 2-year and the 1-year. And I believe you might have the 90-day. Those are short-term maturities. As long as the U.S. has a AAA rating, then it is the safest investment instrument. Because what that means is you're virtually guaranteed to never lose your principal. And you'll always receive that coupon, that interest payment every 6 months. Now, with the dollar as a reserve currency, which assures demand for dollars, which assures that the U.S. can always sell bonds, that means the interest rates offered in bonds issued by the U.S. federal government are low. If the dollar was to lose its status as a reserve currency, then the interest rates on U.S. bonds would skyrocket. I think currently about 2 or 3%. If the dollar was to lose its status, you'd see those rates go up to about 10% overnight. How would that impact the rest of the economy? You had the Fed funds window. The Fed funds window is the interface through which banks, commercial banks, borrow money from the Fed. The interest rate that they pay on that borrowed money is set based on what the Federal Reserve is willing to pay for the bonds that it issues. So if the Federal Reserve issues bonds at 1%, then it might charge 2% at the Fed funds window. So banks are now borrowing at 2%. Now, in turn, banks will lend that borrowed money. They will charge a markup on that 2%. So, to the best customers, to the most credit worthy customers, the banks might charge 5%. That might be your large corporations that have been in business for a long time and have always been able to satisfy their obligations. They might charge 5% to them. Other businesses might pay 7%, 8%. The consumers with excellent credit trying to borrow for a mortgage, they might pay 10%. For a car loan, they might pay 12%. So as you go down the economic chain, you keep adding to the interest rate that the Fed pays on its issued bonds. If that interest rate goes from 1% to 10%, then you might see mortgage rates go from 10% to 20 or even 25%. That would have a significant impact on the economy. Significant. You have to realize that the US government is bankrupt. We owe $22 trillion in debt. 22 trillion. Every year, we borrow money not to pay down the debt, but just to pay interest on the debt. Just interest on the debt. If we owe 22 trillion, all right, and let's say we're paying 5% a year on that 22 trillion, that means we're paying about 1.2 trillion a year just in interest. If the US government brings in revenue, all right, of 1.5 trillion, but we have expenditures of 2 trillion, that means we're going to have to borrow 800 billion. But then we still have to pay that 1.2 trillion in debt. So that's 2 billion that we're going to have to borrow each year. 1.2 trillion of which is just to pay the interest. That is a bankrupt entity. Bankruptcy does not mean that a company, if you talk about corporate bankruptcy does not mean that a company no longer has any assets, that a company no longer has any cash, that a company is no longer generating revenue. Bankruptcy simply means that a company cannot satisfy its debt obligations. If I'm Apple and I make $2 billion a year in revenue, and I have $1 billion a year in interest payments, I'm solvent. Because I could take $1 billion from my $2 billion in revenue and pay off my interest. But let's assume that's when interest rates are at 5%. Let's assume interest rates now double to 10%. Instead of paying $1 billion a year in interest, I'm now paying $2 billion a year. Still making the same $2 billion a year in revenue. I'm still solvent, but I'm now in a dangerous financial situation because my cash flow is now zero. If interest rates triple to 15%, I now go from paying $1 billion to paying $3 billion a year in interest, and I'm only making $2 billion a year in revenue. At that point, I am bankrupt because I cannot satisfy my debt obligations. That's why in bankruptcy proceedings, when the company is broken up, and the assets are liquidated, the proceeds go to pay the bondholders. If anything is left, then maybe the stockholders might get some crumbs. But the bondholders get paid first. That is a senior security. The problem is that currently U.S. corporations are highly leveraged, very highly leveraged. When interest rates hovered around zero, companies borrowed like crazy. They borrowed like crazy. When Trump gave them tax cuts, instead of paying down their debt, they went in the stock market and bought their stock. That is the reason the stock market kept going up and up and up, because he had all this free money circulating. That free money is now going away. But that's another video for another day. So if the US dollar lost its status as a reserve currency, you would see a tremendous number of US corporations filing for bankruptcy. And I'm talking about some of the biggest corporations in this country would file for bankruptcy. You'd see your Apples file for bankruptcy. You'd see your Amazons file for bankruptcies. You see your Googles file for bankruptcies because they could not satisfy their debt obligations. You would also see the U.S. government would not be able to borrow as much as it did in the past. What does that mean? U.S. expenditures would have to pull back. Now, there are two ways the U.S. government could handle that. Either increase taxes, print more money, which would lead to inflation, or cut back government spending. Either way, the U.S. consumer would hurt. U.S. companies declaring bankruptcies means more unemployment. So as you can see, Iran not selling its oil in dollars, Venezuela not selling its oil in dollars, is a threat. It is a direct threat to the U.S. economy. And it is for that reason that I speculate that the U.S. might send some special forces into Venezuela. The U.S. might find a way to motivate and encourage the opposition to overthrow the Venezuelan government. More likely than not, they're going to use the Venezuelan military. So they might bribe some general